welcome everybody back to Woven Wings Live, where we bring you wisdom and tools for vibrant living. I'm Gabe Crane. I'm joined by my co-host, Rahul Didwania. And if you enjoy listening to us, please share our show with a friend or leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can join our newsletter, which is linked in the show description, to follow along the journey. And today we are continuing our Resonance mini-series. We've had the last 2 episodes. The name of our show today is Facilitating Broader Change, the Ecology of Resonance. And if you want to catch up, it's a good idea. You can go back and check out our last 2 episodes. 2 episodes ago, Getting the Feel for Resonance, it kind of outlines this methodology we've been exploring over the last few weeks. And then our last episode was a really awesome dive into kind of resonance in practice. And Rahul was awesome to come forward and share about his own process in relationship to some of these ideas and topics. And so you can check those things out to kind of come current with this episode. And we feel like just jumping in with this one, you can do that as well. The focus today is the ecology of resonance, this notion of how resonance relates not just with ourselves, but with the world around us, with the relationships that we're a part of. One of the core ideas in resonance, in the systems that influence it, process work, Ren Shui, is this idea of totality, that we are existing within a total system. Each one of us is a total system, also unto ourselves, and then we are also part of this bigger universe. And both these things are kind of paradoxically true, and it's important that we look at both sides. And so last time we spent more time looking at our own personal relationship with this idea of resonance. And today we'll see how it's all going to unfold, but we're going to be exploring really how this resonance concept, this approach, is important or can express itself in the broader world. And as part of that, how we make change in the world, how we become part of having a positive influence on the world around us, on the communities that we're part of, the relationships that we're part of, and become part of something bigger than just ourselves. And so in this context, I just want to name a couple things. First of all, that if you're listening to this, you've probably seen the news or connected in some way about the fires that are going on in Maui. This is where I live, where our family lives, and it's been a really, really intense time. And so while that is in the backdrop of this show today, and we'll see how directly we speak to that, but this episode is in honor and connection to that, and part of relating to that transformation process, that tragedy and transformation process that's underway there. And so we're thinking about that. And in addition, I think it's just worth naming, I just came back from a trip in Colombia where I was engaged in a peace building course, Colombia the country, and I was there with Columbia University in conjunction with the University of the Andes there. And in addition, got to spend some time with indigenous teacher and family there. And so I think these elements are influencing our show today, and I think it really goes to what we try to explore on this show on Woven Wings Live. It's the connection of personal development tools with also making a real change in the world. Woven wings, how we are weaving our own wings, but also how we're all woven together into this fabric of life. And so it's a great opportunity today to get to dive into that on a little deeper level. On that note, Rahul, I want to bring you in here. It's good to be here with you again, man. And I'm curious, all that I just kind of laid out, what's sparking for you, what's alive, and where are we going to take this from here?
Pleasure as always, Gabe. And as you were talking, I was taking notes actually, because a lot of new thoughts, even relative to when we were talking about this episode earlier, just started to pop up. And the first one is I feel like this podcast, or at least for us, this podcast is a exercise in the ecology of resonance, right? Where we're coming in, arguably, yes, our frequencies tend to be somewhat similar, but we come in on any given day, in any given conversation, in different places. And then there's a process of finding each other in the conversation. And finding each other and finding harmony and creating harmony, right? And what we hope is whoever listens to this, right, is also then tuning into that. And I know we've talked about, yes, there's the wisdom and the tools that we talk about, but there's also this idea of like having this kind of conversation or having it with this tone. And the people we've had on the show have remarked like, oh, you create a certain, like we create a certain space or a certain frequency that they like tuning into. And so as you were talking, I was just doing a little bit of navel gazing and just appreciating even this project as an exercise in tuning in to what's resonant for us, and hopefully for people that come on the show, and even more so for people who listen to it, right? And this idea that you said around like producing something, having some positive contribution that then ripples out and influences or affects the system. It's just interesting to think about this as a possible medium for that. I mean, everything is a medium for that, but this is a very tangible one. The other thought I was having is I was remembering an episode I haven't thought about actually in a while, which was the episode that we did with Sujana on transmission, and how for some reason that popped up in my mind right now, and I was just remembering like this idea that just like the vibes, the energy, the aura that you come with tends to have this effect, that, and we were talking about it even in our previous episode. For those that didn't tune in, I was going to go to Tahoe. I was going to go on this trip, and one of my goals was to be present. And I think you made this point that, hey, like, if you show up in that way, it's going to impact not just your experience, but your friend's experience. The entire trip is going to get influenced by coming in with resonance versus dissonance. And just the other day, I had a work meeting with somebody who was clearly like distracted, and there were like a few of us in the call, and just one person being that way, like for some reason I was tuned into like how different the meeting could have been. That person was not feeling the way that they were feeling, and they were a little bit sick and whatever. And yeah, these are all just random examples that started to come up for me as you were talking around the connectedness that you were speaking to.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting you mentioned Susanna, because as we talked about in that show, Susanna like helps us at our house in different things, and it's part of why we call that episode Hidden Transmissions, is that everyone, sometimes we get into this like expert mindset of like, oh, I need to go sit at the feet of some expert, and the reality is that we're all potential teachers, and there's so much that people have to offer. And Susanna has been the one. Lakshmi and I and Satori, we're going back to Maui tomorrow. We've been off island, and Susanna's been looking after our house during this time, and she's been the one keeping us up to date on the status of these fires, which came pretty close to our house actually, and she's been the one sending us pictures of the plants, and of the plants with seeds and flowers growing in them, and it's just very potent and powerful to get those images from her, and to remember that amidst all this destruction and devastation, which is of course what the focus is on right now and is what's all over the news, but also that there's life, and that life is renewing and being born. And so yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that, brought her up, and yeah, I guess I'm curious, mentioning these different pieces. I know we talked about some different work things that are coming up for you that I think are kind of maybe related to this topic, and it's thinking about that Tahoe trip and how your state influences and impacts those around you. I'm curious if you can kind of take us into some of this work stuff you're facing and see how we might be able to relate it to this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, Gabe, you and I have often referred to ourselves on this show as coaches, but I know we are also in different capacities, but we're also facilitators. facilitators, right? And this was unintentional, I think, but I was thinking about the title, right? Facilitating broader change. And I was like, this week, I'm actually facilitating an offsite. And it's been on my mind quite a bit for the last, I would say, 8 to 10 days, like pretty consistently. And in some ways that makes sense, just like, hey, taking all this stuff in, just trying to process it, make sense of it, know where to push and pull, all the things that we do as facilitators. But then the other side of it has felt very, for lack of a better word right now, like dissonant. It's been this feeling of wanting to show up as an expert of some kind, and solve all the problems, and feeling an associated pressure with that, right? Which is actually taking away from the joy of being in this process with people. And I think I mentioned this to you the other day, where I was like, I've even had feelings of, yes, I want to go, I want to do this, but man, I also can't wait to be on the other side, just because it's been on my mind. And even just noticing that has been really interesting for me, because increasingly, not just intellectually understanding, but deeply believing this idea that I think comes across a lot in the facilitator world, which is, it's way less about the tactics and the tools and the structure, that you use as a facilitator, as in your effectiveness is less driven by that and more driven by the energetic state that you come in with, right? And that sounds very abstract, I think, to anyone that's problem solving oriented, that's been in these types of sessions. They're like, what does that even mean, right? But it's I believe it, there's a big difference between the facilitator that's there, that's grounded, that's humble, that's loving, that's tuned in, that's noticing everything, right? And picking up the information in the field and channeling it, but also just holding space. There's that facilitator, and then there's a facilitator that just thinking, and putting pressure and thinking about the structure and thinking about the information, thinking about what comes next, trying to constantly land the plane. And I've noticed both sides of myself popping up. But when I think about this idea of facilitating broader change, and in this particular instance, there's some tension in this group that I'm walking into. I'm like, yeah, the way to alleviate that tension, and the goal that everyone has stated is, hey, we don't want to dwell in that tension. We want to move forward. And it's okay, that doesn't mean we're not going to acknowledge it, but it also means we have to feel differently about what's happening. And some of that feeling, not all of it, some of that is going to come from my feeling, as I'm a co-creator of that space. So that's just a bunch of different thoughts that I've been holding and navigating and feeling into, just in anticipation for this work event this week.
Yeah, it's quite for folks who are facilitators out there. I'm sure you can relate. I can certainly relate to what you're describing, Rahul. And that kind of maybe if you're a performer out there too, because there isn't performative element, I guess, to facilitation. And if you're an actor or a dancer or whatever, it's that feeling before you're going up on stage of what's going to happen? Am I going to be good? So I can really relate to that. And I think what's also interesting to me is you described the tension that's also there within this group. And I think, it's natural that alongside your own, anxieties of your own role, that when you're facilitating this sort of thing, you also pick up on that, right? You're with that tension. And I think when we get again into that thinking mind, it's we're trying to figure out how do we solve it or get past it. And I think when we're looking at it from this other lens of resonance, there's something different. That's actually exactly not that. It's more how can I hang out with this tension, or get to know it, invite it to tea, see if it wants to spend more time with me. And one thing I noticed, I'm curious what you think about this, but we talked about this before the show too, about that impulse you're noticing to like get to the other side of like, oh, it's just going to be so nice when I get to the other side.
Yeah.
And the way you were naming with this group as well, that there's like this kind of collective intention to like kind of not live inside the tension, like move past that. But there's like something similar there, I think, you know, of like, let's just move on. Like, let's just get to the other side. Like, let's just pretend in a way that all that stuff's not there. And maybe if we just like will ourselves into that, so somehow it'll just magically disappear, you know? So I'm curious kind of what you think about that, just that dynamic. Because I mean, I guess last thing I'll say about it is just that in my experience, it doesn't usually work that way. You know, like the more we try to like just move on, the more it just feels like something just keeps hanging around. It doesn't leave. But I'm curious, any thoughts you have on that?
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more, you know, and I think in general, right, it's kind of a fallacy, right, that, hey, we'll be better over there, you know, and it's like, well, not really, you know, I mean, it's because it's not going to go away, right, and what is the way to get through it? I mean, there is a part of me that's like, when I'm a few days from now on the other side of it, yes, like the like, pressure to perform that, you know, you mentioned artists. I also thought of like athletes. Like I remember running cross country, you step up to the line before they shoot the gun and get you going. It's like there was this tension, right? And it's like, oh man, this is intense, you know, and running is like by definition uncomfortable. You know, and it's like there's this feeling while you're running, it's like, man, it's gonna feel better when I'm not running, you know. And there's truth to that, right? I think there's some truth to like getting to the other side. It might be less stressful, but I think it feels a little bit short-sighted, you know, because it's like there's also a role, right, that this conflict and this tension is playing in the journey of whatever we're trying to create, right, whatever we're trying to build, why we're even meeting in the first place, you know. And it's like to move past that, it doesn't make sense, I think, from the client perspective or from my perspective. And then for me, it's like, well, I'm doing this work, right? I'm doing this work for a reason. I like want to do it. I want to play this role. I want to grow. And it's like, well, all of that happens in it, not on the other side of it. And so it's like, I don't know if that's the right way to think about it or if it's just a way to think about it, but I'm curious, you know, if that lands with you, or like how you would look at it from like a resonance perspective.
One thing that this whole topic has made me think about is one of my teacher's books. So Arnie Mindell, who's one of the founders of Process Work, he has a really amazing book called Sitting in the Fire. And I guess like, especially with fire being a major theme again, you know, this week, I think it takes on like another level of like resonance and importance. But this is an excellent book for anyone interested in facilitating, for anyone just interested in learning about social change work and community organizing and also spiritual practice. And I think one of the big things he talks about in that book is that we need to sit in the fire, not literally in the fire. You know, there are times when we have to escape the fire and get away from the physical fires, but that in this deeper sense, there is this fire burning in the world. And kind of what we are generally always doing is like trying to get away from it. We're trying to avoid it. We are trying to be comfortable. We are trying to make things easy and forget about it. But it's there, it's burning. And as we do that, it gets bigger. It actually has more of the capacity to do more harm the more that we try to avoid it. And so what he talks about in that book is the real work of placing ourselves on the chopping block, so to speak, being willing to face the very difficult challenges and complexities that are part of life, and in a way let ourselves get devoured by them. to allow ourselves to get kind of eaten up by the realities of the challenges that exist in the world and how they exist inside us. You know, a lot of the time when we're trying to get away, we really like to externalize things. You know, I've been following all this news about Maui. Everyone wants to blame someone, point a finger at someone. You know, you read these comment boards, and it's very easy to externalize what went wrong and then kind of pin the tail on the donkey, so to speak. And it's a lot more difficult to sit with ourselves and our own complicity, our own participation in these systems, because how can we not be complicit? It's like, it's one total reality. That's, I guess, one of like the major themes of this episode today, is that it's one world. We have inequality, we have capitalism, we have colonialization and industrialization, and these are really complex dynamics. They've created good things in a lot of ways, they've created really bad things in a lot of ways. And if you really take in the wholeness of nature, humanity, all the different diversities that we have within that humanity, then it's hard not to be moved by the complexity and the intensity of that. And you know, if you hear that, depending on where you are in your personal identity right now, or where you are along whatever, the political spectrum, your relationship to our modern society, how you're doing socioeconomically, you might already be relating to this in any number of ways, like thinking like, oh, well, now I don't like what Gabe is saying because I'm feeling threatened in some way. Or maybe on the other side, you're thinking that, yeah, these are all the problems, like all these kind of like isms I just named, and the solution is to burn it down and like get rid of them and start over. And I think that's, personally, from my position, I think that's also not quite it. Or that's also one piece of a very, very complex whole. And so when we're really thinking about facilitation, about resonance, again, that somehow this resonant state, this connecting deeply to operate from a place of heart awareness, heart consciousness, compassion, empathy, if that is actually valuable within the context of all these problems, you know, these challenges that I just described, we have to be willing to get eaten. You know, we have to be willing to see the relationship of ourselves with all these different factors, and then see how that moves us into some sort of action. And I think that one very valid criticism of people in kind of the self-help world, personal development, coaching, is that this is really like industry and a practice of privilege. It is constructed out of the ability to have all your basic needs met already and have disposable time and income to devote to personal development. And that, I think, you can criticize and complexify anything, right? So even that, we can kind of respond to that in different ways. But on another level, it's very real. It's very, very real, and it's something that I think needs to be taken seriously, and that I think we have that intention, at least on this show, to really connect dots between that world and these worlds of social change, equity, of working through our relationships to actually make the world a better place, not just to make little bubbles of kind of self-delusion or, you know, like a nice feeling for people who kind of have all the resources to be able to do that. And so in order to do that, I think there are no easy answers to any of these questions, but I think that's part of what Arnie's talking about in that book. Is just because there aren't easy answers doesn't mean that we should kick our feet up and watch TV and bail on this conversation. That in fact, it's really our purpose and our obligation to be deeply involved in engaging around these topics.
Very well said. And I wonder, you know, it's like for someone who's like not inclined, if you just like listen to what you just said. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. Again, you're saying all these things, but it's coming from that place, that place of privilege, of disposable income, of time, of you live on Maui, which up until recently is like, it's like, oh my God, like you live in that place. And it's like, it's interesting to feel that judgment come up as you were even talking about it within myself, and recognizing my own situation too. It's like, okay, I'm like living in San Francisco. I've been here for a few years, like just like all these things, right, that are contributing to this feeling of like privilege and being able to contemplate these things. Like that's one stream of thought. The other is just going back to the basics. I think the principles that you mentioned, right, around like, how do we connect with our own sense of compassion and love and empathy and bring that to situations and allow it to reverberate? And it's like this idea that, hey, it's like there's an imperative to do that exploration, to find that for ourselves first and foremost, because even as practitioners, it only comes out if you've cultivated it within yourself in some capacity. And I'm thinking still about what you're saying around like, hey, that tension, that desire to just get out of the discomfort, right? And rather, like, what would it look like to be curious, to take that stress and that pressure out to tea, right? And to sit in the fire. And so I'm curious, Gabe, if you can take us deeper into what does that mean? What does it mean to sit in the fire? What does it look like? And, is it just you do it and then you magically come out on the other side and you're connected more deeply to something or the other? Or like, what is that exactly?
I think it's an ongoing process. So it's really an orientation, and it's an attitude that we take towards life. And I think that, what is it that I want to say here? I think usually the tension is painful and tricky, and we have this innate desire to avoid it. So we kind of have talked about, on the one hand, I kind of painted these two versions of that before. One is to ignore it and to watch Netflix and just to say, like, there's nothing I can do about it. It sucks or it doesn't suck. I don't really know. This kind of whatever, on I go. I don't have time for that. I think the other extreme is guilt. I think that we are also seeing that a lot in our culture at this point, is kind of this heaviness that comes in of this, if you start to face it and you start to feel like, oh my God, this is just awful. And like, how can I ever watch Netflix again? How can I enjoy any element of the privilege I have, the resources I have, when I know how bloody it is, how messed up it is, the suffering that people are experiencing as a result of it? And I think we've seen this play out in certain ways and it's ongoing, it's still there. But I think over the last several years, as we've had all these social change movements that have been very important, I think that along with that is this guilt, this heaviness, this weight that I see that in different communities that I move around in and work with, where it starts to really get you down. It's heavy. And I think when we sit with both of those, and especially looking at that like heaviness for a minute, I think it's like what's valuable is to juxtapose that with this whole resonance idea that we've been talking about, or this whole notion, from Ren Shui, from my teacher Yuansa, about like, and from many, many others, about, life is about being happy. Life is about being in a light state. It's not good to be heavy like that. It's not good to be burdened with this guilt and this like kind of overwhelming sense of inescapable, dread about all this stuff. And so I think the question really becomes, how do we walk in that center way while being of lightness, of being in a good state, so to speak, of being musical about our life, being resonant with our life, while being very conscious of all these dynamics, not turning a blind eye to that. And so therefore treating those tensions with care and love, with attention, to continue that metaphor from earlier. It's like, yeah, take them out to tea. Maybe sometimes taking them out to tea does mean like going to the firing range or something, or like blowing off some tension in certain ways. But in many others, I think it's really about how do we allow these elements of life to actually enter into our consciousness, to be present, and treat them with compassion, with love, with grace, and actually listen to them, not just kind of brush them off or say you're just angry, but actually allow ourselves to be moved and changed by them, to listen to what's being said. Like, okay, right, maybe there's a way that in my position I can do something different that would make a little bit of a difference, not just in my mind, in my spiritual practice, but like in my behaviors and my actions. Maybe there's something I can do. And alongside that, maybe there's a way that I can allow this reality to be here and to treat it with love, finding this sweet spot in between. And so, really this, I guess the idea here is, again, like resonance is not just for yourself. It's not just something to experience by yourself, but really everything deserves this love. It deserves this awareness of its deeper truth, its deeper reality. And through that, then we can actually start to incorporate these energies into the practice of resonance, we could start making music with them when we start honoring them and taking them seriously, and also being committed at the same time to the wisdom of the music, that the knowledge that all these elements are here. And if we just hang out in the fire, if we just angry or externalizing the problems, then we'll burn ourselves down. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that for right this moment. I'm curious what that brings up for you, but I think it's that middle path of listening, taking it seriously, and being committed to the principles that lead to good things, regardless of circumstance.
Yeah, as you were painting that picture, I was just imagining like an activist listening to this and just taking it in. And because, I think the image that often comes with this idea of caring about something very deeply, right? Or you mentioned the guilt, right? It's like, if there's some bad stuff going on, it's important that I take it on fully, and it's my responsibility to be fully dedicated to it. And I admire that type of commitment. I notice as you were talking about this, but there is something to that, and I think that admiration probably comes from a general societal veneration of that type of commitment. But then I was also just imagining that archetype, the person who's ultra committed to a cause, as a result, doesn't allow themselves to indulge, and indulge is the word that's coming to me because it implies that that gluttony or that doing something that's not in support. And I imagine them hearing what you're saying, and this is purely a projection, but I feel like they would listen to it and kind of shrug it off, they'd be like, oh, sure, yeah, that sounds nice, but what does that really mean, right? That sounds like you're not taking the issue seriously enough, right? And it's funny because that judgment isn't even my own, and yet it feels very like real. Like I feel like I can just imagine it. I can imagine having a conversation with somebody and them saying that, and my not really having like a strong retort to it, but just taking it in, and I think there's the other part of me that would have a retort, which is like, hey, what would it look like for you to be doing the same thing that you're doing, looking to have the same impact that you're trying to have, but without that weight, without that guilt, right? And with lightness. And I sense as I put that other option out there, my own bias towards that. But I don't know. I feel like that person or that archetype would still not really get what you're saying. And I'm wondering what your response to that would be.
Well, I think that when we go into this process and think about being facilitators, and whether you're like formally facilitating or, we can all be facilitators of our home life, of what's going on at work, in our communities, whatever it is. When we kind of take that seat, when we make that choice, I think part of what happens is we move out of this, like bit by bit, the more we contemplate this, we move out of this kind of more judging mind of like that there's some sort of right way to go about this and a wrong way to go about this, and that some people are doing it right and some are not. I think it starts to bring us into like the recognition that like, hey, well, everyone is where they are for a variety of different reasons. And actually, instead of passing that judgment, I can share that compassion and love with them and appreciate, not just in like a kind of top down, like I'm somehow above you or more knowledgeable in some way, but rather like, wow, like I can just appreciate the reality of your experience and I can respect it. I can accept and respect the reality of your experience. And I think when we start to do that, these principles, these inner principles that we're talking about are really, they are universal. They're self-similar across the board. And so whether you're talking to that guy eating, I'm imagining like him like eating nachos with his feet 30 feet up on his like sofa or something, watching Netflix, whatever is going on there, like that guy too, and the activist, when you are willing to respect them and be in this frequency, I think that in both cases, it starts to become apparent to them that like, well, yeah, like it would feel good on the one hand to be like a little bit more conscientious or aware, or allow myself to go inside. And similarly for the activist, that like all these, if I want to sustain change, and there's a lot of this work going on in the activism world, that if I want to sustain change, I have to take care of myself. I do. I have to be able to let myself breathe. I have to bring life in. There's no way that I'll be able to keep doing this without that. And I think that when we're willing to make space for that, then nature's intelligence begins to express itself through all of us in different ways. And it's not really on us to like retort or to like convince someone or debate them. It's not about any of that. It's about making space for this wisdom of nature to begin to come through. That's what I would say there.
Yeah, and what I heard in there was this point around kind of like sustainability, right? And we were talking about the ecology of resonance, and all of that was starting to coalesce for me. And I think the like image I have, right, is that, hey, like when we're operating from a centered place, harmonically, musically, in resonance, feeling positive, feeling loving, it's a very nourishing, like, power for ourselves, but also, like, as we've been talking about, like, to everyone we're connected to. And I think the opposite is also true. When we're not in that place, we feel ourselves wither, right? And that has its own magnifying effect as well. And it's just like that, just from a purely like application lens, like that just feels really easy to grasp. I can imagine a lot of what we're talking about right now is like sounding very abstract or very just like conceptual, to like somebody that might be taking it in. But something as simple as like, hey, like if you are lighter, if you're less stressed out, if you're more tuned in to like who you are and what makes you tick, if you're connecting with people, all of those things like are good for your health. I think we talked about that in the first Resonance episode. And it's like when you are healthy and you're in a healthy state, then you're more likely to impart that on anything you come into contact with, right? Certainly the people in your lives, you mentioned family, people you work with, people you run into in the street, the plant in your home that you look at with a different nourishing lens, the thing that you're building, right? Your craft, even if it's not like a living thing, it's like there's going to be something else, right, that goes into it. And I get that all this feels abstract, but at the same time, it feels very real, to me, just talking about it, and I can like envision it, right? It's like, hey, when I'm in that place, it just all that happens naturally.
I mean, it's a state that is very much, it's just right there for all of us in the present moment. We're always doing one or the other, along a spectrum. And so perhaps it sounds abstract, but I think, if you just take a moment, if you're listening to this, to think about what's happening for you right now. What voice are you following? That are you identifying with in your head that's constructing your sense of who you are and what you're making of this conversation? And what sort of quality is there? And where does it lead you? You mentioned health, Rahul. Creativity is also something that begins to emerge from resonance. When we are in a resonant state, we can begin to allow creativity to enter. We can begin to see new possibilities of relating or intervening that we maybe didn't see before when we were angry or we were upset. It's as much about being able to actually enact some sort of wiser change in the world as it is about also creating health. I mean, these things go very hand in hand.
Yeah. And as you were asking those questions, I was trying to think myself, I'm like, hey, what's happening for me right now? And I think one of the things I was tracking was there's me in the conversation, and then there's the me like tracking our conversation and thinking about it from a listener standpoint. And I was like, oh, okay, there are these like different lenses. And then there's me like pretending to be a listener and just like, okay, what would it be like? And I was like, oh, interesting. Like depending on which lens I'm in, I'm going to show up to the next thing I say very differently. Like right now, this is me just responding to you. And then if I go into that other mindset of like, just like, hey, what is this like? I'm feeling an inclination to like summarize. I'm like, hey, we've been talking about all sorts of different things. Like, what are we really saying here? Like, is it as simple as, hey, things can get uncomfortable, and that, we sometimes run away from it, or it triggers certain responses in us. But if we can just be with it, if we can just connect with what's there, allow ourselves to process it, and then emanate from there, that through the connective fabric of our lives, of the world, because everything's connected, that has positive change. That's the thesis, or positive contribution. Yeah, I don't know. That's just some stream of consciousness thoughts. I'm curious what you would add to that summary or what that prompted for you.
I appreciate your transparency, because I think that if you follow our show and listen to this, it's what we're really working to do. We want to provide you with valuable ideas and wisdom, tools, all this. But we're also really trying to support you through listening to this back into a more aware relationship with yourself. And so, Rahul, as you're speaking and kind of demonstrating those different lenses and modes that you can go into, I think it highlights that reality that we're doing all the time. All of us are engaging in that. It's the nature of how our minds work. And so I think that's very valuable, and I appreciate you doing that. And I also appreciate you summarizing. I think that is the essence of what we're saying, that the world is a complex place, and it's not all rainbows. It's not all fire either. And that if we really want to make a difference and have a better world or even a viable world for our children and grandchildren, this is something that we really all need to be engaging in as much as we possibly can, and to be walking this path and being conscious of these different elements of life and our place within it. Wanted to share just like a few pieces of insight and wisdom from different teachings and my teachers, and maybe I'll add a little context to our conversation. The first is a story from Kabbalah, from Jewish mysticism, about the creation of the world. And I mentioned earlier this idea of putting ourselves on the chopping block or getting eaten by life. But in Kabbalah, they talk about the many attempts that God made to create the world that ended in failure. That before we ended up in the world that we have, God made many, many attempts to create the world, and every time it didn't quite work. It didn't work until God put himself or herself or whatever on the canvas, so to speak, and actually allowed himself to be dismembered and torn apart by life. And only through that was he able to generate a structure of the world that was sustainable. Just let you noodle on that a little bit. But within this teaching, it's not just us, this goes back to really, we talked about sustainability. That's part of, in this lens, how God is sustaining the world, is allowing himself to be devoured by it. So that's one thing. A second thing is the core motto and teaching of Ren Shui, which is Zi Du Du Ren. And that translates as help yourself, help others. And Yuan Tse, who's the creator of Ren Shui, also often talks about this as two legs for walking. You need both. You need to help yourself. You need to help other people. It's not one or the other. One is not better than the other. They both complement each other, and they need one another in order to continue walking. And so when we think about kind of nourishing ourselves and then thinking and being willing to be open to the vast dimensions of life on this planet that we've been discussing, we can take what we do to improve our own life, to gain health, to gain clarity, and we can turn that towards making a difference in the world. That's a second thing to think about. And alongside that, it's when we actually start really doing that, and we're willing to open up and be present to all this fire, all this complexity, and allow ourselves to be part of that, then it also transforms us more deeply. So it actually starts to help us. So both of these elements are complementary to one another. They feed off one another. They grow off one another. And the last thing I want to share is something that Mamo Sanchino, who I was just sitting with, who's a Kogi elder. The Kogi are an indigenous tribe from the Sierra Nevada in Colombia, who I was just getting to spend time with in Colombia. And in their teaching, they talk about the debts that we create through our very existence, through the fact that we use, just as a product of our life, we use stuff, we eat things, we build things, we extract things from the earth in order to construct our society, our technology, all these things. We also use one another. We have talked today about all these different teachings and teachers who have been involved in helping us out along the way. And in a certain way, we are using their wisdom, right, to create insight and to create this episode. And so what they talk about in this is really being with the reality that we are using that, and that use creates a debt. It creates a imbalance in nature if we don't recognize it and return the favor, so to speak. Or one way they talk about that is canceling the debt. We have to actually recognize all these things that we're doing to be able to live, and in some way pay off our obligations. And one way that they talk about doing that, there's a lot of different ways, but one way they talk about doing that is song. And I think that makes sense within our conversation about resonance, the musical nature of that actually in their tradition, they sing to the fire, they sing to the wood, to the water, to the ancient people that created different plants and different areas and places and created the world. They sing to their food, and they sing to both the good path, so to speak, and the bad path in life. And so as we face all this complexity, I think we try to open up the lens onto facing the intensity that exists in our world, and to see the relationships between the inside and the outside, that there are fires in the world today, and what does that reflect from the outer world onto our inner world, and to open up to how can we transform that energy, how can we pay our debts in not a way that's about guilt or stress or all these things, but actually in a way that's reverent, which is beautiful, and which creates something harmonious in the world. And so, yeah, wherever you take that, if you want to hum a little tune, most of the songs I've heard while I spent with them were not performative pieces, if that makes sense. They were not melodies that you memorized or words that you memorized. They were sounds. They were taking the opportunity to say, I'm focusing my intention and my awareness around my gratitude, around what I've used, around who has helped me, and I am giving back through this organic sound that's just coming up as it is right now. And so just some different thoughts that I think helped me, that I think are valuable, that I'd like to share here.
This path you just took us through on all these different learnings, it actually is funny. It got me thinking about so many of our previous episodes, and I had a little trip down memory lane. That last piece around sounds, I was just remembering Brian E. Hill, our, I think, episode 3, right, where finding your voice, and just not from like a technical sense, but from a inner soulful sense, right? And I think this idea of that being something that's given, that's paying back a debt, that's beautiful. That's a really new concept for me. And I'm connecting it to Om, Om as the universal energetic sound in Hinduism. Like, that's for some reason what was coming to mind for me. And it's like, wow, that is technically a set sound, that's repeated, and prayer and all that. I think the essence of it is really just to like make the sound, and to be in the sound, and to be with it, and to be in harmony, right? Because that's the sound of the world, of the energy of the world, and it's like some of that was just coming back to me, reconnecting again with transmissions, as you were talking about all that. Then I was also remembering in this debt concept, I was remembering Pesach and like the episode on the art of taking. And again, I think those concepts are ringing true here of just like being conscious. I think a message we repeat over and over and over. And in a way, I feel like this entire episode is just like a reminder of all this, is like, be conscious, be aware, be tuned into yourself, be tuned into the world, and like, don't be cynical. Like, what we do matters because of the ecology, because of the connectedness. That is the sort of the focus of this conversation. And then, I was also thinking about paradox, right? And the paradox of thinking that, hey, we need to be serious and this and that. And maybe that is, your personality. It's not that seriousness in and of itself is bad. It's still like the weight, right? The weight being good versus and making you more effective, or being a necessary ingredient to be effective, when actually the opposite is true. And maybe they can both be true, but it's like, it's this interesting thinking about all that. And I think the final conversation that was coming to light, I don't know why I'm so reflective today in our chat, but the final episode that was coming to me was the one with Shimon, and just about like laughing and lightness and entering that state of play and freedom and joy. And yeah, I think with that, I'll just say that this is a very timely conversation for me. As I've mentioned, I'm going into that engagement, that facilitation, over the next couple of days. And that's how I want to show up. I want to show up to make music, to make poetry, to connect, to tune in, to be fully there, and not thinking about being done. And that will be something I have to bring myself back to, I imagine. It's not going to be there the whole time, but it's just such a encouraging place, bountiful place. And it's like, even if something doesn't happen, right, or if a certain result doesn't happen, I think from that place, one, it's more likely, two, it'll still be like a meaningful experience, and a meaningful opportunity to connect with the people that I connect with, and hopefully facilitate broader change, in whatever form that takes. With all of that, I'm feeling a sense of completion for myself, I think, around what we've just been talking about. But so yeah, I'll just pause there.
Yeah, thanks for all that. That's really awesome. Also made me think about just your recount of these different episodes. Made me think about our episode with EFAM and their work in really doing real social change work, real community building, meeting people in need. And so just shout out to them out there doing that as well. I'm glad that all this has kind of trickled back to your facilitation and your offsite, Rahul. And I really hope that I feel we've kind of loaded up the wagon here with a lot of good stuff. And I trust that I could just tell I could hear it in your sharing that you are going to carry that forward. And if you've listened with us through this too, I hope the same for you. And I trust the same is for you, that wherever you're going into, that all this has filled you up with a lot of good things to operate from and to bring that into the world. And I think the last thing I just want to say is that we are all full of this love, full of this resonance, full of this medicine. And I think when we can allow ourselves to really open and to see the world that's happening around us and allow it to penetrate us, allow it to pierce us and our armor and to really touch us in our heart, then that medicine starts to get working and it starts to come out. And yeah, the world's a complex place, but it can be as simple as that if we are doing that, good things will happen around us. And as more of us are doing that and finding one another, more will be able to change. I guess the last little story I could share that my friend David shared with me when I was in Colombia is he was recounting a story from someone else. In fact, if you take a coconut, it floats in the water, but if you push it down, you can easily push it under the water. But if you take that coconut and you tie it to other coconuts, then it gets progressively harder to push it under the water. And eventually you can't do that anymore, and it's floating. And so I wish the same, and I trust the same for us in this community of people that are doing this work. People we have met, so many people we have not met all around the world that understand this and that are doing this amazing work of change. And so, on that note, I guess I just want to thank everybody for tuning in with us today. It's been a deep dive into some of this work, check out some of the resources that we've explored on this show. Sitting in the Fire, Arnold Mindell, it's a great book. Ren Shui, whatever it is, if you want to get connected to some real good healers in Colombia, you can also hit me up. So just look out for whatever it is. We are continuing on and grateful that you're with us on the journey. Rahul, you're saying you feel complete. Is there anything you want to add before we close today?
No, I think that's it. So thank you to the listeners for tuning in. And as always, if you enjoyed listening to us, please consider sharing with a friend, leaving us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, or joining our newsletter, which will be linked to in our show description. And otherwise, I guess till next time. I don't know, Gabe, if you had anything you wanted to add.
No, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you all as always, and we will see you soon. Bye.